hear the sounds of your heartbeat. I can hear it now. I can hear it now. I hear the sounds of your heartbeat. I can hear it now. I can hear it now.
All right, so for today's Heartbeat segment, I've got Drew Weatherhead from the Social Disorder Podcast. Drew is an Albertan and currently residing stateside. So, Drew, you've lived an incredible lifestyle throughout the COVID scamdemic, and I refuse to call it a pandemic because they just lied to everybody about the risks and benefits and all of the pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical interventions that were taken. So, why don't you give us the elevator speech on who you are? And I do notice that you got your one of your books up, consciousness, reality, and purpose, and you've got another one that's coming out here. So, why don't you give us the elevator pitch and give us a little bit of a lowdown on your books, and we'll take off the conversation from there.
Okay, so first of all, thanks for having me on. Second of all, do you want me to start with my story or do you want me to get into the books because they're kind of connected but kind of separate?
I'll let you decide.
Okay. Well, for those of you out there who follow Sheldon who haven't checked out my podcast, that's where most people who know my story are from. So if you know that story, you're going to get some repeat. But otherwise, yeah, I am a Canadian from Alberta. I had a Brazilian Jiu Jitsu Academy in Blackfalds, which is central Alberta. And I started that about a year and a half before the scamdemic, in Sheldon's words, kicked off in 2020. And at that point, I had just started getting into the black. You know how it is as a small business owner. You're, trying to make ends meet for the first year to get to the point that you're making some profit. And we were at that point where it was finally starting to click and come together. And then I heard about this thing in the news where I'm going to have to shut down for 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And at that point, I was okay, this is weird, but sure, I'm all for that. If this is something everybody's doing, 2 weeks isn't going to break my back, and everybody will be back. They can, I can adjust the monthly rates for the students for that month to reflect the 2 weeks they weren't there, and we'll just carry on. Well, if you can remember that many thousands of years back in COVID epochs, it wasn't actually 2 weeks, and what it turned into, to make a very long story short, was essentially 17 perpetual indefinite months of flattening the curve this way and that way, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. And it was just never ending. And especially in the the industry that I was in fitness, we got hit really, really hard. Fitness was a hard one to be in because of social distancing, which was one of the preordinate worries of, the concern metrics, the vectors of concern since the very beginning of that whole process. And you can't do physical fitness, especially in martial arts where I'm doing physical grappling with other people. You can't keep 6 feet apart. So for any point, and so we
Sorry,
played
just going to
that.
cut you for a second there, Drew. You got cut off for a second.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, you were at grappling with others. You can't do via
Yeah, you
Zoom
can't social
call or
distance that.
Skype.
Yeah. I will apologize. My Skype is going to drop every now and again. I'm on Elon's Starlink, so it's as good as his satellite systems are. Yeah, so in the martial arts you have to be person to person. There's no social distancing. So for the time that those mandates or restrictions were ever imposed, we were simply shut down. I was just in an empty gym for those periods of time, but had to make money to pay for the bills, which could be anywhere from $10,000 a month, depending on what bills were landing when. And it's just an impossible ask, like whatever savings I had were gone within the first couple months of that nonsense. And then from then on, like I was working on goodwill, I was working on loans, I was working on, just get around the corner, just around the bend, and we're going to be free of this stuff for the better part of 17 months. So at that point, it had just completely financially broken my back. I ended up folding the business. And in fact, we made a very hard decision to sell our house, which I was the sole income provider to afford at that point, but it was our only access to liquid asset that we had left. So we sold our house and put it into a travel trailer and a truck where I have housed my family of six and been on the road ever since as unvaccinated people during the pandemic, which is a really untenable position to hold in Canada, being that you can't winter in Canada in a travel trailer. So you have to go south and do the snowbird thing. And getting across the border in 2021 late, which is when this was happening, we had to get across the border before November 1st of 2021 because that's when the travel restrictions were coming down on unvaccinated people. And at that point, the border was still considered essential travel only or vaccinated travel only. And so we um we had to fly over before we weren't physically allowed to fly within about 3 weeks of that, but also bring our unit across the Alberta Montana border because that's how we live. And, not to go into all the particularities of that, but it barely worked. We barely made it happen by affording a favor out of a friend who was a dual citizen who drove our unit across for us with the written permission from a lawyer saying he could do so. And then we had to get PCR tests for myself and all my kids, which was like $2,000 worth of cost right there, plus another few $1,000s for the plane tickets for 6 people from Edmonton through Vancouver down to Seattle, and then drive our family with a rental car over to Montana to meet our unit. It was insane, but we have been perpetually on the road now for a better part of 2.5. It's going to be 3 years come June this year, where we've been living 6 months up in Canada and 6 months down in the States, and trying to make my living online through the podcast, through my jujitsu programs, and through my books.
And to me, that's just an incredible story. And so obviously, assuming you were against the vax,
Mhm.
what was the decision on that part? I mean, you've gone through some pretty extreme lengths with you and your family. And I'm sorry, it's you have 3 children, correct?
4 children, yeah.
Four children, your wife and yourself inside of a travel trailer. I mean, those are some pretty extreme lengths to go through. So obviously, the vaccination was not something that was in the cards for you and your family
Mhm.
to go through those measures. What was your decisions based on for that?
Yeah, you know what? When it started, when I first made the decision that I wasn't going to take it, it was more of it didn't even seem like a big issue to me because I had made that decision in April of 2020, long before it was ever publicly available, because I heard the rumors that science is going to be working at the speed of science. We're going to go warp speed and we're going to have out a brand new novel technology with this new injection we're working on within 16 months. And it turns out they got it out within 9 months. And I remember at the beginning of that rallying cry by April of 2020, I was like, "Oh, that's cool. I like science. I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna wait and see how this works." And I felt like that was a pretty level-headed. It was pragmatic. It was prudent. I was just like, I don't necessarily need this thing. It's a respiratory virus. I'm a healthy, young, virile athlete, and I can probably just wait and see. I'll do the social distance things for the sake of my business, and I'll stick around, see how long that lasts. But once this thing comes out, I'll wait for the first iteration of it to see how it goes, because to me 9 months for a vaccine is just too fast. And to me, that was the decision. It wasn't like I will never take it. It was, if this is actually the silver bullet they say it is, I want to see the proof. I want to literally see it in society work, and then I'll jump on. And in that process, for like the first 3 months when it came out, I didn't see it working. In fact, very shortly after that, my sister got paralyzed by her first shot of Pfizer. And between all of the news that I was seeing, the alternative news coming out, as well as some early scientific findings that were being censored, like I was paying very close attention to both the pros and the cons to try to lay out, is this something that I want for myself and my family? And it just never got to that threshold of I feel good about this at any given point.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us were in the same boat. Now, your sister Becky, correct?
Yeah,
When did she get her Pfizer injection? And it was paralyzed from the waist down, correct?
yeah, that was right.
So when was that? That was just early 2021, and she is in British Columbia, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, she's a teacher. So she was one of the, because people got allowed to the first doses in waves, right? They went by those first responders and the elderly and the infirm, and then they moved to the public sector and the first, I think I said first responders, but teachers were early on that list. We'll put it that way. They were in one of the first couple tiers of people during the rollout. So she thought, great, I get to this early. Finally, I can finally get past this pandemic that we've waited a year to get over. So excited to get back to school with all my kids. And so she got this thing, she got her little picture, she got her little band-aid and her little card. And you're supposed to wait, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks, I think 4 weeks between shots for your first one to your second. And about a week before she was supposed to get her second shot, she was driving down the highway with her kids in the back seat, and her feet started to go numb. And like, not like when it first started, she said, like, I felt like it was like I was sitting on my legs for too long in the way that they start to go numb sometimes, but both of them at the same time. But it was perpetually traveling up her legs, and she started getting concerned because she's working at highway speed now, and she can't really feel her feet that are controlling the pedals. So she managed to get to the side of the road, put it in park, and by that point it was full paralysis up to her hips, where she literally couldn't feel her legs at all, and she didn't know what was going on. She phoned a friend, was panicking. Her friend came and picked up her kids and took them back to her house to take care of them while she basically got an ambulance ride to the clinic to see what the hell was going on. And without going into all the details, which ended up being 10 months of nonstop perpetual gaslighting that it couldn't possibly be the vaccine, she finally got to the point at that stage where she had a neurologist who not only signed off on, yes, this is a vaccine injury, but clearly this is a vaccine injury because I have like half a dozen other people in my personal practice that presented the exact same thing that I'm dealing with right now. And so, I mean, it spoke both to the physical um, dangers of the actual intervention, but also to the sociological reaction to it and what you can and can't expect when that or if that eventually happens to yourself.
And in Canada, Justin Trudeau introduced the vaccine injury support program. She did try to apply for that and was rejected too, right?
Yeah, she got to the final stage of that. That's like they try, and this is typical of any bureaucracy when it comes to giving away money for anything. Like, try to call your insurance provider and get them to pay for something. They will find every excuse under the sun that they don't have to pay, even though you have to pay them every month, right? So it's the same thing with the VISP program. Is they say it's vaccine injury support. There's no support. They just try to offboard you as often and as easily as possible. But she got to the final stage of it. I think there's 3 stages of sorting, and it was down to her and like 6 other people out of thousands of applicants. So she clearly has a case. And by that point, her case was put towards, I believe it was one um, general practitioner and two, I don't know, it was like biological researchers or something like that. None of them were neurologists, and they had the signed affidavit of her professional neurologist saying that this is my professional opinion that this is a vaccine injury. I've seen it before and I have other patients like it. And they said not good enough. And they said case closed, try again next time. And that's it. She's never had any comeuppance for this. And as far as science and medicine in Canada is concerned, she's not vaccine injured. So how many other people are out there like that that don't even have as prescient interventions and injuries as she did, that also ended up being siphoned off along the way of you're not vaccine injured after all?
Yeah, when Canada claims that there's over 11,000 peoples that have suffered from severe injuries, but only about 130 of them have actually received any sort of vaccine injuries or support for their injuries, it's yeah, you know that they're not really keeping up with this. And there's a lot of a lot of ideas that kind of go around that, and how long that they're gonna willingly take these claims, as well as if it was a pre-existing condition but got worse, it couldn't possibly have been the vaccine, or if there was other prescriptions involved that may have caused a vaccine or that may have caused one of these adverse events. They were ready to accept it about other medications instead of the vaccine, so they wouldn't have to call it a vaccine injury. Which to me seems like, if a pharmaceutical company puts out a drug that's causing an adverse reaction, you should be getting injury support from that drug. Now, whether they call it a vaccine injury or whether they call it a drug injury, there should still be some support mechanisms that are put in place. These things are supposed to be tested. They're supposed to be safe in the market. Now, Becky's not on any other prescriptions that you knew about at the time, correct?
No, certainly nothing that was you would have to get a prescription from. Like, it'd just be like pain pill stuff, over the counter stuff, if anything.
Yeah. And, I'm sure a lot of us are in the same situation, a couple of aspirin or a couple of Advil, whatever that looks like if you have a headache or
Yeah.
stub your toe or, whatever. No, so that's incredible. So, I mean, I can definitely see why you would be that much more adverse to the vaccines and why you'd work that hard to protect your family. Now, when you crossed into the States, seeing the lunacy that was going on in Canada at the time, and going through, the incredible story that you'd kind of brought us through. What was the United States like at the time? Was it, as crazy? And where did you hit to first?
Yeah, so the US is very interesting in that although we live in Canada where we've got a bunch of different provinces and territories that are, on paper separated by, degrees of difference, it's really actually quite a homogenous society that we have in Canada. And we saw that homogenous aspect present itself as all of the premiers kind of got in line at some point along the pandemic. The States is very, very different in that they have 50 basically different countries that are connected together. And so as you would cross state lines, you would enter in and out of different eras of COVID. It was very fascinating to see. And there were certain states that were way worse than other states. Like the first state we got into technically was Washington, although we blasted right through it. That one was weird because when we were trying to stop for some food along the road, there were no workers to work. They were at a serious worker disadvantage at that point because everybody was taking their government stipends and staying home instead of working at McDonald's. So that was the first thing that I noticed. But then when we got to Montana, it was like there was no pandemic anymore. It was all of the switches that were switched on in 2020 were flipped off. And that was the weirdest one I think of all because we were literally on the same contiguous mass of dirt except for an invisible line between Alberta. And it was pandemic on above the line, pandemic off below the line. And that was, I think, the most stark representation of the difference between Canada and the US. But then as we went through different states, like California was worse, New Mexico was actually horrible. It was even worse than California. I found in California, people were playing the pandemic game as much as they had to, but really didn't believe what they were told to believe. Almost like the stories from the USSR, where like the goods comrades would do what they had to do to stay out of the gulag, but nobody actually believed what the government was saying. Whereas in New Mexico, it seemed like everybody was on board with the COVID hysteria, and they were like mask everything. We got yelled at one point in a Walmart for not wearing a mask. Georgia was another one that was surprisingly like that, which looking back shouldn't be so surprising because we were in Atlanta, which is actually the headquarters for the CDC. So I imagine there was like quite an ethos of that was going on there. But yeah, we went through Florida and we went through Texas, and those states that really lived up to their reputation of freedom and sovereignty, and you do you and you don't hurt me, and we'll meet in the middle somewhere. And they were definitely like a good reprieve from the COVID hysteria in general, but certainly stark difference to what was going on in Canada.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, you know, in the beginning days, and I traveled to visit with one of my cousins, and they're out in rural Alberta, and we just stopped off on the way back in from another stop. So they're out Ranfurly way, just out by Vegreville,
Mhm.
and they couldn't give a rat's ass about what anybody was saying on the news. Like it was really nothing. And at the time, my mother had just passed, and that's when they were still limiting the amount of people that you could have at a funeral or a celebration of life. And because her friends were also elderly, we thought, well, we'll just wait for the right time, so that we can get together and celebrate her life together. Well, that time has actually never come. And, right now, one of her favorite friends, my godmother's passed away as well. And it's all been inside of these crazy little lockdown situations. When they're limiting the number of people that can go into a hospice to visit somebody that's dying, to me, that's it's the height of lunacy, and I don't think it does anything to protect anybody. And what it does is it makes the passing of a loved one that much worse.
Yeah, I had a similar situation in 2020 that my grandmother ended up passing away, not of COVID, although they would have loved to claim that, I'm sure. But I was at that point still trying to figure out what was going on. I think this was like the spring or summer of 2020. And where I was at up in central Alberta wasn't locked down. There weren't mask mandates yet, but she was down in Calgary where the funeral was going to be held. And I was of the position because of the news that I was hearing from Calgary that this is basically like a quarantine zone. Like you don't want to go to Calgary unless you have to, kind of thing. And so I actually made the decision not to go down to the funeral. There was only, I think, 30 people even allowed to be at the funeral. But I was like, I'm just gonna have to watch the Facebook feed of this because I don't want to risk my family. Essentially, I was tricked. I feel like looking retrospectively,
So you were
where they've
tricked into missing your grandmother's funeral. That's where we'd
yeah,
kind of cut off.
yeah, that's essentially where we where I left off. is I do recognize, and looking retrospectively, realize that there are real world affects to living in a false reality.
Yeah, and I think, as Canadians, we all did our best to get along and get through this. And a lot of us kind of believe the we're all in this together shtick. All the people banging their pots and pans at 6 or 7 o'clock at night for the frontline workers, and sending them pizzas and donuts and Tim Hortons coffees, and letting them into Costco ahead of lines, earlier than everybody else was allowed to go. I mean, I think a lot of us were okay with that. Even in the beginning stages before we really knew what was going down, I was even okay with shutting down the schools for a little bit. COVID was never a risk factor to children, and that's something
Yeah.
that I think they knew before anybody would let on. And there were a lot of people that were on social media that were saying, no, kids are at no risk. And, having had kids through the school system, I know every cough, cold, flu, head lice that went on in the school system. If it was if it started with one child, it would spread rather rapidly. So, I mean, that was an idea that I could get behind until learning more about, what was going on, and then what they decided to do to keep people safe. And I mean, I've said since the very beginning, burning children to keep adults warm was just a terrible idea to do, and that's literally what we did. Closing down parks and playgrounds, closing down schools, shutting down their learning, forcing them into masks. And then 2 years after, when the survival rate on children was almost perfect. And the imperfect part of it is that the fact that there are still sick children that
Yeah.
may have been tested positive with COVID, and may have passed in that time from the disease that or the conditions that they had. I still maintain that nobody's died from COVID. Canada itself, and I'll put up a screenshot of this, but Canada itself can't or hasn't defined what a COVID death is. So they say it's something that's that resembles the symptoms, and they're going to call it. The only way they can actually tell if somebody died from COVID, it's not if they've tested positive for COVID, is if they've defined the symptoms that it would have created, and then tested for live cultures. So somebody would have had to have passed. They test for live cultures to see if the virus is still actually alive in their body before that they can actually assume that COVID was the culprit. And in the 58,000 deaths in Canada, that has been done exactly 0 times. So without a proper definition,
Wow.
without proper testing, the number of actual deaths that can be attributed to COVID is zero, because they never scienced it right. No, it's incredible. So now, Drew, things kind of let up last year. But even at the beginning of 2023, Biden hadn't removed the restrictions. I think it was May of last year that Biden finally removed the
Yeah.
restrictions for Canadians to be able to travel into the U.S. And I was supposed to go down to a conference in Texas last year, and that's how I know. We were booking the show and the accommodations and stuff in December, and I said, listen, I don't know when the restrictions are going to be let up, and I can't travel. And my company was fine with that. And as it turns out, the conference ended 1 week, or the conference was 1 week before the mandates ended.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, so I mean, could have had a nice free trip down to the stateside and hung out in Texas. So yeah, I wasn't able to do that, but you obviously went back across in the to cross over for the winter of 2023 to 2024. Now,
Hmm.
is this going to be your lifestyle? Have you kind of got acclimated to this, or are you planning on coming back and settling back in Canada?
Well, yes and yes. Actually, we have acclimatized to this quite a bit. Like I said, we're coming up on 3 years, and we'll continue this indefinitely until we can get out of it. But the goal is to get out of it, and we're actually looking into a couple different possibilities when we come back this spring. We're only like I think a month away from coming back mid-April at this point, so we're going to be looking at a couple different possibilities. But I mean, I don't have to tell you the housing market is not terribly kind right now, and it's not like we're made of money from a podcast, so there's some financial considerations that we have to suss out. But yeah, it is our goal to not only get a house but to get some land with it so that we can start to become a little bit more self-sufficient.
And the idea of the getting some land and being self-sufficient, has that stemmed from your experience with COVID, or is that something that you've always kind of looked at doing?
Well, my wife has always wanted to do that anyway. She's a bit of a farm girl, but yeah, for myself, 100% it came from you can't rely on the government for basically anything. And to if your actual survival requires that, you're just waiting to die essentially. And I mean, this is a story that is age old. It's not even particular to Canada. I mean, we have so many different people who fled their countries in Eastern Europe or wherever, whether it was communism or socialism, they came here under those pretenses. Like our governments, screwed us in the worst possible way, and we need to get out of that. And so for us to finally be able to learn that even in the democratic west that we reside in, I think is a valuable lesson. Because I mean, it's a trope in martial arts too, where I make my living typically, is nobody can come to your defense faster than you can. That's why you train, right? So the same thing is true of being able to sustain yourself. Do you have access to fresh water if the water system goes down? Do you have access to food sources if the supply chain goes down? There was a quote from the 1920s. There was a reporter back then. I wish I could remember his name. Um, he said that polite society is only ever 9 missed meals away from anarchy. So 3 days without food, and you're going to see what people are actually capable of. We live in polite society due to our ability to get free and easy access to our needs. But so many people, the majority, myself included at this point, don't have access without that polite society being uh, unbroken. So if at any point it does get broken, whether it's a pandemic in the future, disease X, or whether it is a cyber pandemic that the WEF keeps chirping on about, or whether this is, fill in the blank of all of the different catastrophes that are constantly going past your news feed. I just got to know that if any of them do happen and do stick, I've got eggs, I've got water, I've got access to be able to not be part of that anarchy in the first little while society crumbles for however long it does.
Well, yeah, because that's what we'd seen in the early stages of COVID.
Yeah.
Again, my mother was in the hospital at that time. So I was commuting from Calgary to Edmonton, and I was staying with my sister. So, we'd spend our day inside of the hospital and then come home in the evening, eat dinner, and then, watch the news. And they talked about, what was going on inside of the grocery stores, and they were running out of toilet paper. And like that was the big thing. Everybody talked about running out of toilet paper. So we'd finally eventually went into a superstore that was close to her house. And yeah, for sure, like the entire paper goods aisle was completely wiped. Like it was barren. And, as we'd walked a few more aisles, then we'd started noticing that there was a lot of shelves for canned goods and rices and
Yeah.
pastas that were also completely wiped. And like to me, it was surreal because it was like I blinked and this all happened because we just weren't going into the grocery stores. You'd hear about it on TV and you think, that's insane. That's not happening. They'll come up with toilet paper. And no, man, it was like it was so strange. And then you go into the frozen goods aisles, wiped out. So yeah, I
Mhm.
believe that 9 meals deal. That people, if they feel they're in jeopardy, they're going to do anything that they can, and that would lead to yeah, some anarchy for sure, and especially on the toilet paper side of thing. My wife, funny story. My wife works with a cleaning company, and at the time she was worried about the toilet paper situation too, even though it's just her and I that are at the house here. Um, and so there were these cases of toilet paper that were originally slated for one of the commercial accounts that they had. They weren't going to be used, so she ended up buying them from her employer. And she gets these things home and she's like, okay, well, I've got the toilet paper thing handled. And, she puts the first roll on and it is commercial grade. Like it was like 30 grit. It was terrible stuff. And I just said, I'm not using this. You know what? We've got enough toilet paper. There's only two of us. And I think we still have those 3 cases somewhere around the house. And I mean, we're going on like 4 years of having like this toilet paper kicking around. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in coming back to Canada, and looking for the homestead and stuff, do you think you'd go back into another business type situation? Is that part of the goals too? Finding a homestead in a smaller community and restarting up the gym?
Um, there's a couple different reasons why the answer is no right now. Partly because I can see the susceptibility to having a brick and mortar that you're tied to. Like there is a liability aspect to that when it comes to you need that to continue making money. Like obviously that was the case. And in fact, when I was in that position, what saved me almost primarily, almost exclusively, was the ability to make ethereal online money, right? Through something that's not corporeal, that's a brick and mortar that you're tied to. So for that reason, I'm not super inclined to have to go into another lease at a hard and fast location. But beyond that, and this is the real reason, is that for the years that I spent all of the money, blood, sweat, and tears to build the business that I had before it got essentially ripped out of my hands, um, I spent majority of all 7 days of every given week doing that while my kids were young. And I missed more or less those years of my kids growing up. And that was a sacrifice that I was willing to make once, because I thought that it would pay off, and it would have if it was unimpeded. But I don't think that that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make twice. I've sacrificed a few years of my kids' growth, on the altar of my own private business, and going to go back into that position again, I need to allow for them to mature a little bit, because you know as much as I do, any parent knows that the formative years are the early years of a kid's growing up, and a figure is incredibly important. And for that time period, I would be gone in the morning. They'd see me basically for breakfast, and I'd be back at like 10 p.m. So they wouldn't see me throughout the whole day. And for me, I don't want to be an absent father, and I don't want to cast whatever type of negativity that does psychologically onto my kids just for the sake of my business if I can avoid it.
Yeah, and I'd gone through the same thing. I was running two businesses when my kids were small, and I missed a lot of those firsts. And it was a really hard thing to do. I did it under the right premise that, my wife wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, and that I was willing to put in the 7 days if I thought that that was going to lead to the better outcome. And I worked myself almost into the grave. And when I had some time, finally, and after I'd gotten rid of my businesses, and when my kids were moved out, my first granddaughter was born, I was actually fortunate enough to have some time to take a year off and just spend with her, because I couldn't go back and recapture the days that I'd missed with my children. So, like, that was a big thing. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be able to do that at an early enough age. But no, it does take its toll on you, takes its toll on the family. And now that you guys have been, this close for this long, I could imagine there'd be some separation anxiety, and yeah, it might not play out as well. So now that you are looking at your online revenue streams, let's talk a little bit about your books that you've got going here.
Yeah, I've got one that if you're watching the video, you can see the title for is Consciousness, Reality, and Purpose. I brought that out last year, 2023 February, I want to say. And I will be bringing out my second one April 1st. So the first one is basically a culmination of all of the podcasts that I had run up to that point, which was about 200 episodes by the time that I got to the decision to write a book. And oddly enough, I mean, what I do on my side is I run a podcast 5 days a week. It's a full-time job as far as I'm concerned. Every single weekday there will be a podcast out. So to do so, you can't just keep pounding at one topic or even two topics. What ended up happening was I covered all sorts of different topics, whether it was pop culture in the news, or whether it was philosophy, or whether it was religion, or whether it was, whatever in between. And I had all sorts of different guests come on in the meantime. And what that did that I wasn't expecting, talking to each other in this very strange way, that emergent ideas started coming out of the culmination and compounding of them. And what that did was create a force, like a pressure inside me to release in some way. And I found that writing a book was the best way to do it. So I literally just started writing down all of the ideas and different schools of thought that I had come across and what I had come um to the conclusions of, and in a way that allows the reader to come to their own conclusions too. And it is around those three major topics about consciousness. It's very fascinating. I have nine chapters written on consciousness, on reality, what even is reality, and our perception of it, which speaks a lot to the ability to project false realities into the zeitgeist, for 9 chapters, and then another 9 chapters at the end on purpose, which I found a lot of people were asking the question of, especially over the pandemic, is what is my purpose? Because I'm not quite sure anymore. The world seems to be flipping upside down, and I don't know what to make of it. And it comes back to what a lot of the Stoic philosophers and the Buddhists back in the day would come to, is the recognition and discovery of the self. And it's a powerful thing to come to that recognition of, and it re-empowers the individual towards the sovereignty that I think a lot of us were missing when we needed it.
I don't want to go into like a mass conspiracy theory, but I think that we as people have gotten too attached to titles.
Mm.
The early days, it looked like a briefcase, then it looked like a business card, then it was, a button on your lapel or whatever, and it was basically your job title, and it was a job title that was put on your desk or on your office door. And then they, rather than branching out with additional wages, they realized that people would fall for this, and that became their identity. In that, instead of just being a team member, you could be a team lead. Now, that didn't actually get you anything. It didn't get you any extra money, because it was, everything was still based, or in a lot of positions, it's still based on longevity. How long have you been with the company? All it got you was extra responsibilities, but you got this, I'm team lead. And I think there was a lot of companies that kind of preyed upon people by way of title, to either lift them up without giving them a raise, or to keep them kind of sheltered in place, saying, okay, we'll give you a little bit more money, but you know what? You'll never achieve much more than this level of um, ranking inside of the company. And I think it's hard. And I've gone through this before. If you've, been released from a position, your role gets removed. And, for whatever the reason, then you feel like your identity has been mapped around the position and your job title. So, you get a company computer these days, you get a company phone, and working with companies. And then when they decide to pull the plug, or if something changes within the business, and I'm sure this happened to a lot of people throughout the pandemic, is that they lose their entire identity. And then you go into this massive depressive state. So unless you're defined in your own purpose, I mean, I can see, what this has actually created inside of the pandemic. So that's actually a really interesting topic. I could go into more about that. And your second book that's coming out now, Drew, in April, what's this one going to be about?
Yeah, so this one, if the first one, and I did say this in the first book, that it's an effort in exploration. The first one was explorative. I didn't want to explain things, I just wanted to lay them out and let people sort of onboard them as ideas. The second one is explicitly explanatory, which was a much, much harder book to write. And it's called Layers of Truth. And it goes very deeply into the entire idea of truth, which I think was something that emerged out of the pandemic for a lot of different people, is the recognition that what we are actually, we think that we're living in an objective world when actually what we're living in is a subjective world. And there's no other way out of that position. We are unfortunately and inextricably linked to our subjectivity. And what that presents then is only a small facsimile of truth. And I'm of the belief that there is a total truth, that if there is something objectively true about every given thing in the entire universe, then there must be totalizing, holistic, total truth. But the problem is that we're subjective beneath that totality and have to try to piece together, kind of a la carte, piecemeal, what we think objective reality is. And what seems like a very simple concept, truth, a 2-year-old can tell you what is true, right? It turns out that that is a very fundamental and incredibly difficult conversation to get into, and I get into it for over 50,000 words. In specifically, I lay out my ideas of a construct of layers of truth, how you can have different layers within total reality, which is akin to total truth, that some things are true in one layer that are also true in another layer, but there can be a conflation if you think that they're the same layer that you're talking about. An easy example in the cultural world we live in right now is the trans movement, where basically they forward the queer theory from the idea of the cognitive, that there is somebody who is mentally trapped within the wrong physical body, and they make all of their art at the cognitive, and then they conflate the layer of the physical, saying, well, then therefore you must change the physical, which is wrong. And that's the wrong way to go about it, because the physical is right in its physicality. The mentality or the cognizant side of the person is different, but it needs to remain different within that layer. You can't foist that difference onto a layer that it doesn't reside within. And so that's how you get all of these unnecessary interventions like puberty blockers and surgical interventions that at very best are chemical and surgical cosplay of something that the physical body of that person simply isn't. And this level of prescribed reality onto objective reality can be perniciously sought by people who are looking for power or presentation of their ideology in a way that can present a totalizing false reality. And I mean, we don't even have to go into all the different versions of that. So the purpose of the book was to make explicitly clear the difference between layers. And then what I did is I took that construct and I overset it over a construct that I built in the first book, um, where I stated that I believe to have a well balanced worldview, because you can't have a totalizing worldview, but you can at least try to balance your perception of the one that you're within. And to have a well balanced worldview, I suppose or presuppose that you need to have three pillars within that worldview. One is the scientific, one is the philosophic, and one is the theologic. And I think that there needs to be a balancing between those three, and to the atrophy or the derision of any one or two of those pillars, you're going to get an off balancing of your worldview. And so I look at the construct of the three pillars as opposed to the idea of layering truth in three chapters, where it's truth in science, truth in philosophy, and truth in theology. And I try to find the untruths and the truths within all three of those pillars.
Now, inside of those pillars, can there just be a general acceptance that there's possibly something greater that's looking over, or possibly something that's philosophical that I haven't come to understand or come across yet? Or do you have to be like firmly rooted into the concepts?
No, well, the concepts are up to the individual, which is always the case, right? This is something that I think a lot of people
Subjective.
get wrong. Exactly. People think that they just need to learn what is true. And what that typically leads towards is finding whatever accepted systems of truth are out there, whether it's an orthodoxical religion or whether it's an orthodoxical scientific worldview. There's some sort of orthodoxy they want to seat themselves into so they don't have to do any work. And what that does is it just basically says, this is the subscription model to reality that I've bought. It doesn't mean you know reality. And what's interesting too is when people do that, which I think is a lazy way of onboarding reality or trying to figure out what's going on, is in the meantime, even though they think they have whatever set of total answers they have, they're going to be predicting and creating their own prescribed reality anyways. Whether it's not consciously, it'll be subconsciously. And I go into Freud and Jung that talked about the shadow self and the dark passenger and the subconscious and the ego and the id and all of these things psychologically and physiologically that are happening. Even if you think you know the answers, they know that you don't, and they're sort of stuck in the chaos of the milieu of what that presents. And I try to, almost like, the number one overarching idea to get in people's minds in both of my books is we don't know even a little bit of total reality. And to be able to start from that position is actually a benefit to the person who exists in it. Like, you go back to Socrates, who is considered the wisest man in Athens and the progenitor of the classic philosophers. He said that if I know one thing, it's that I know nothing. I mean, Michael Malice had a great quote on a Joe Rogan episode not too long ago where he said that the most intelligent and knowledgeable person on earth right now is ignorant to 99.99% of all knowledge. So if you understand that that's literally the position we're in, it breeds a necessary humility instead of this hubris that we get of people that think they know everything and need to push everybody into whatever that is supposed to be in reality. And I mean, again, we can talk about all of the previous examples over the pandemic of the science, and you don't want to go against the science, and it turns out that the science had a face and a name called Fauci, and you didn't want to go against him. And like, it turned into, and I think it just presented what it already was this orthodoxy. And if you were heterodox to the orthodoxy, well, now you're the problem. You're the fringe minority that needs to be either dealt with or get in line to what is considered the only acceptable perception of total reality.
And I think that could be applied to the entire healthcare system, not just the experts, and not just definitely through the pandemic. I mean, there was a lot of people saying a lot of really stupid things. You need to take the jab so my jab works. We can't expose ourselves to the dirty unvaccinated people. Well, if your jab works, then why do I have to take it? Or you need the jabs and the masks, or you need the masks and all the things that they kind of stacked on top of each other when you look back at it. And that's what I continuously try to do, is remind people about how stupid these things actually were. but applied to just basic medical science that we're where we're at right now. I believe that, yeah, we're inside of this orthodoxy where it's easy for people to accept a common conclusion without investigation, and just go along with a guided set of protocols. Well, we're not that.
Hmm.
Our bodies are a lot more different than, you can list your symptoms. And, throughout the pandemic, we got away from going to doctors. We got onto this teledoc thing. And I had this conversation yesterday with somebody, and there was no benefit to closing down doctors if they can't see what you, who are what you actually are. Then it's not much different than you trying to describe your symptoms to Google and Google docking your own
Exactly.
cures. And inside of that, you go to the doctor and they say, well, don't look up, your conditions, or don't Google doctor yourself. Meanwhile, doing the teledoc thing, I believe, was a lot exactly the same. So, my grandson had, at one point, he was sick and he had 103 temperature. So just as they were about to take him into the doctor's office, the nurse called, and they went through some symptoms, and she gave a diagnosis, not the doctor, the nurse, and said, "Don't come in." Well, turns out they were wrong. And when you have a child with 103 temperature, you're looking for more than a phone call from the nurse. So it's a terribly stupid idea, but they accepted that as being a lot more successful, and especially for people in rural areas. Well, with the benefit of Starlink and Google, or insert random search engine, what's the point of going to the doctor if that's all we're going to get? There's another layer inside of that where everything's not cured by, but fixed by pharmacology.
Hmm.
And I have a huge, huge problem with that. And that's part of the reason that I wrote my book on just chicken soup, because I wanted
Yep.
people to have a base understanding of where our medicines actually came from. And even quoting Hippocrates, he said, let food be thy medicine. And, his early prescription for respiratory viruses was chicken soup. So I was able to take something from 5th century BCE and go through the modern day science, go through the nutritional values, go through fasting and autophagy and how the body actually works, to actually sell the benefits of a 5th century cure still being better than what we're seeing from the pharmacy. Let food be thy medicine. And then on the other side of things, in going through what the immune system is, our immune system will react quite the same with physical injury. You stub your toe. If you've been poisoned, you eat some undercooked meat, whatever. Or if we catch a virus, your immune system is engaged in the same way. So if you've taken a jab, you have to engage, you have to employ your immune system. How do you weaken your immune system and believe that that's actually going to make you stronger? And in the history of the world, I don't believe that that's actually ever been scientifically proven. That's a part of the orthodoxy. But now they have this over the last 3 years, they have this anti-vaccine or anti-vaxxer. They can just discredit you with the one word. And I
Yeah,
believe,
it's akin to saying heretic.
yeah. And I believe that that's the same reason that we still see the vaccines being implemented right now. It's because it's a good way for them to shut down a conversation immediately. If they admit that they were wrong, if they admit that the vaccines did nothing good to bring us out of the pandemic, if they admitted the harms they actually did, then it would give the rest of us that elevation that they couldn't stand. We were right all along throughout the pandemic. We'd seen what was going on. Your sister suffered through 10 months of torture with her family. How many other thousands of Canadians have gone through the same thing? And it's all been done through the orthodoxy. And now we're seeing this implemented by way of MAID. What's your thoughts on medically assisted suicide?
Man, that's a brutal, brutal project that they're trying to employ there. First of all, there everything always comes as I don't like to talk about things as zero sum. There are always going to be fringe cases and reasons why you can make your argument, and typically it comes down to some um, less than common version of what is an empathetic thing to do. There are reasons why certain people might want to end their lives instead of carry on suffering indefinitely. And there are fringe cases where that would actually make sense. The problem that I have is going to be the bureaucratic implementation of this and how those fringe cases start to become less and less fringe towards the center, where it just becomes a service call, you know? And there are people out there that might just want to push the off button, and the government just has a call that you can make and like a couple different checks you can check off a checklist that you can go online, find the correct answers to get them to say, yes, you need the maid. I don't like the slippery slope that that starts to put our feet upon if our society is going to get to the point where you can just have, like, you remember Futurama? There was a joke on Futurama, which was like a Simpsons sort of takeover, it's set in the future, and they had suicide booths where you go in like a phone booth and you plug in a quarter and it'd kill you. And it was a joke. It was morose, but it's basically like an extended version of what we're talking about with Maid. At some point in the future, it's going to become so common, whether it's this generation, 2 or 3 generations removed, where you can just literally legally and efficiently kill yourself, and the government will help. I I don't like to live in a society where that's the case. Like, I think that suicide should be taken very seriously, and that any person who wants to end their life outside of natural means should try. We should be trying to, as a healthy society, help them either ease themselves out of that psychological distress that led them to that point, or if it's legit and it needs to be done, it needs to be done with absolute deference to the process. And I don't see that in Maid.
And I think that's a lot the same as what we would probably go on if we talked about, executing criminals for, the most egregious of crimes,
Yeah.
where they say if one innocent person is put to death, and that's too many. And you know what? I am the same, that there are certain conditions, but I mean, I even look at, the medical orthodoxy on the exact same thing too, in just a state of dementia. So when your body's still alive but your brain is dead, I look at dementia as a humane way of evolution, basically letting you know that you're supposed to die. But we've gotten so good at keeping people alive on sugars and carbohydrates that all we have is an empty shell of a person. We don't have that person anymore. Dementia was meant to take away the pain, was meant to take away the suffering, was meant to take away the memories.
Mm,
But if we're keeping people alive long past that, then we should either be looking more towards what's the actual cause of the dementia, and when what dementia, what actually happens, and it's not all dementias are the same. In the nearest that I can realize is that the body realizes that it has chronic inflammation that it's not able to heal from. And the same energies that are using to feed your brain are being used as part of your response, your immune system. So once those are depleted, the first thing that happens is they deplete from your brain, and then it tries to keep your body alive so that it can comfortably allow for your passing. But if we replenish those energies properly and we actually look for source of disease or source of inflammation, then we can actually cure conditions. And then when it comes to a point where we realize that that's no longer a possibility, then we can look at alternatives. But like you said, it's got to be like these extreme situations. We can't. In Canada, there's been people that have wanted to commit suicide for ADHD and because they can't find
mhm.
affordable housing, and they've signed up for the program. And to me, yeah, sure, you're leaving behind good organs for other people if this is early enough. And that's, where Canada is saying the boon is that we've got, so many more organs that have become available through the MAID program. And it's like, you want to talk about morose on putting a quarter in a suicide machine. Well, that's it.
Yeah.
The other side of it is people that have paid into life insurance for their entire lives. Medically assisted suicide is the same as suicide. There is no
Mhm.
insurance on that, from as near as I understand.
Mm. So that money just goes back to where? To the government, to the company?
It goes to from what I understand, if you commit suicide and you have a life insurance policy, you don't get to collect on that policy. Everything you've paid into that policy now becomes, like you said, when it comes to insurance companies, they look for reasons to not pay you.
Mhm.
Medically assisted death is one of those.
Mm.
So, I mean, if we really wanted to go, deep down the rabbit holes, I'd say that anybody that's still getting the jabs right now, that's, in a terrible situation, I'm thinking that they're expecting something bad to come from the jabs, and it's just a different way of dealing with their situation that'll allow them to collect on their insurance, or their families to collect on their insurance, without having to go through the MAID process and losing the benefits of their insurance policies. Crazy conspiracy, I know.
I mean, add it to the list. I've got shelves full of crazy conspiracies. I don't discount any of them off the bat typically, but I'll leave them on the shelf and see if a pattern emerges over time.
Well, and that's it. We're still called the crazy conspiracy theorists, yet, when you were right from the start. I wasn't worried about COVID. Sure, people that were old and sick should have been.
Hmm.
Anybody young wasn't. And I mean, you went through your process for evaluating yourself and your family for the vaccinations. I mean, all I had to do was look at the statistics. In 2020, there was 20 people inside of my age group, 10 men, 10 women. I'm guessing even distribution that had died from COVID. So that was the total statistics. Of that, 90% of those people were had more than one health condition that was pre-existing, or they were obese,
Yeah.
which means my risk to COVID for mortality was zero. Now, I've gone through the medication routes. I had, some health issues in past, and one of the reasons that I'm really not that high on our healthcare system inside of Alberta or Canada, and it was prescription after prescription that made things worse and worse. And when I was in pain, then it was add pain meds, and then when I couldn't
Yeah.
sleep, it was add sleep meds. So it was nothing to right the wrongs. And again, this is where I found food as my medicine. But it was nothing to right the wrongs that was going on inside of my body. When I found out that I could control all of these things without the use of medications, that's the way I did it. So when it came down to assessing my own personal health and risk, I'm adverse to taking prescriptions that I don't need, and I'm adverse to telling or people telling me that this is what I have to do to make me better.
Yeah. Well, isn't that value adds like something that you've learned from, having to figure it out the hard way, like trial and error? And I think that's a valuable lesson to take for people out there to maybe that they can avoid the trial and error and just get to where you've ended up. So, I mean, it's so good that we've got people like you out there saying exactly these on the hope that there are people out there that will avoid the detriments that we had to go through.
No, and I think that's correct, but I think everybody has to, we can hand over a piece of knowledge, but until it becomes your experience, what's
Mm.
your actual acceptance? What's your level of truth based on that? What's your subjectivity versus your objectivity?
Yeah, that's a tricky one too, because and you hear about this from rich and successful people when they're talking about their kids, because typically rich and successful people, unless they were generationally wealthy, which is very rare. Take, for example, an actor, somebody who was incredibly good at acting, made hundreds of millions of dollars over their career, and they raise their children knowing that they're likely not going to have that type of opportunity in the world. And the question then arises, and I've heard certain people in these places say this publicly, like, I'm worried that I'm raising my kids in an environment that won't give them the benefits that I had that got me to the position where I'm at. So do I let them live a hard life, even though I have the ability not to? And it's almost like a trolley problem, like this philosophical issue of, do I protect them from the hard things that could hurt them, but also that made me who I am to be able to protect them from the hard things. It's a bit of a quandary, but I think it comes down to, and this is where I started the second chapter of my second book in Truth and Philosophy, is that the word philosophy means love of wisdom. Philosophia means love of wisdom. And what it comes down to for philosophy, which is what should be the divining rod to find truth, is the ability to discern with wisdom what is wise. And wisdom is one of those things that you can be told, but you really have to find through your own experience, which speaks to your point, which I think is very salient.
No, and that's exactly it. Now that I have a better understanding of my body, I mean, people come to me with a lot of health questions, and I can give recommendations, but I don't push ideas. I say, listen, this is what I've found with my body, and that my body doesn't react well with inflammatory foods, and there's a reason that they're called inflammatory. So what I try to do is steer away from inflammatory foods because that triggers pain, weakens my immune system, and makes me more susceptible. When you give somebody an idea of what something does instead of and that's always been a thing for me. It's don't tell me what to do, tell me why I need to do something. Because as a technician, that's the only way I'm going to actually be able to retain the information. And there's a lot of information that comes to us as negative information. They say, when you're up high, if you're afraid of heights, they say, don't look down. And what's your inclination? To look down, right? So you get lost in the muddle instead of saying, if you continue to look up, you're going to be able to maintain your balance and you'll be less anxious about the experience. Then somebody can gain from that. If you say don't look down, now they're terrified as crazy, crap in their pants, and what have you really done? So the don't give me the what to do, give me the why to do has always
Mm,
made more sense, and that's in the same messages that I try to deliver, and whether it's through my Substack or whether it's through even what we're doing right now. I want people to come out. I want people to have their voice because I want everybody to see, this is why we can never do this again. Tell me your story. Give me your heartbeat. And that's what so many of us are about. Taking these ideas that we've learned throughout the pandemic and moving forward with them, hopefully creating the world that we should have had prior to letting everything come undone.
mhm.
Now, do you pay much attention to the political landscape inside of Canada still, or like are you entrenched in the whole Biden Trump thing right now?
No, interestingly, I try to keep abreast of Canadian politics more than American, which is actually hilariously, convexly easier to do for me from the States than it is from Canada because I have access to alternative news down here. I get it on my social media feed now. Can't get it up in Canada. And I realized that when I went back to Canada for a weekend in February to host a jiu-jitsu tournament, and my phone started binging off of Canadian towers again, and I lost access to all of the alternative news. So actually, I get more bipolar information. So from both sides of the category, whether it's CBC or whether it's Rebel News, I get both sides of that down here that I don't get up in Canada. So in a weird way, I feel more informed down here than I do up there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have looked at, especially with Bill C-63 coming on board or potentially, where people are going to be more afraid to stop talking, or sorry, more afraid to actually talk or say their mind or their opinion.
Yeah.
That we're going to see a lot more of that. So yeah, no, that's actually kind of impressive, and I think we see a lot more of the one side. I mean, it's always one side in Canada, as you're aware, right?
Yeah. The other side is dangerous dis and misinformation. Didn't you know?
Well, yeah, and that's they call us that, and it's exactly what they portray inside of their own feeds. It's amazing. So, coming back into Canada, like what's your thoughts on an up and coming federal election in what, 18 months from now?
Yeah, I just talked about this actually on a recent show on my side with our mutual friend Sean Newman, and I was asking him because I'm like, I'm heading back to Canada in a month. Give me a barometer check of where exactly we are with the heat of this place. Because from what I'm seeing, I see Bill C-63 coming on that ostensibly is online harms bill. It's going to protect kids from child predators and child porn, and great, everybody agrees with that. And then at the end, they tack on this. Oh, and by the way, we're going to come after hate speech and we're going to define what hate speech is as we go, but we're going to tell you right off the bat that it can have a lifetime imprisonment tied to it if we think that you are emitting hate speech to a degree that is genocidal or whatever caveat they're going to decide along the way. But if this bill gets passed, then I mean, we've already been titled these pejoratives to some degree or another over the pandemic so that when we hear this, when normal people, moderate people that don't have a public voice here, like they're going after extremists that are demanding genocide, they're like, well, good, go after the extremists that are demanding genocide, put them in jail. The people that have been saying alternative things or things that are against the narrative, they know that those are the type of rejoinders that the system comes back with all hyperbole against people like us, whether it's creating the pressures for a trans genocide or whatever. They'll fill in the blank with whatever hyperbole they need to basically be able to go forth and in the worst possible dystopian affect of this can just gather us up and gulag us essentially. So that's the worst possible case of what could be coming down the line. Now, obviously, we've only got about a year and a bit until we have a possibility of a new government, but I've stopped putting my faith in the next politician. Polyev, for all of his benefits, if he gets into power, I don't rely on him for my future. I don't think that that's a smart thing to do. And this is another thing I had to learn through my own personal experience and come to the wisdom of is that no politician is coming out to save you. So I don't know. I clearly want Justin Trudeau out. I think he's 3 terms longer than he should have had. I dread a fourth, considering the type of things that he's been pushing, whether it's or C11, C18, C63, whatever it is, and the combined power that this Thanos gauntlet he's building for himself may yield to whoever wants to be inclined to yield it in the worst possible way, that concerns me. And I don't know if Polyev is going to be the foil to that, or if he's just going to be the next progenitor of it, or just going to be a reprieve before the next person picks up where Trudeau left off. I don't know. I have very little faith. I'm kind of like black pilled when it comes to politics in Canada. I've just been abused by it so often for so long right now that I'm very skeptical. I think that the ethos of my podcast, if I were to give it one, would be one of skepticism and existentialism at this point, because it seems like the appropriate mode just to keep yourself safe.
Yeah, and I'm not even going to disagree with that. The one thing and who's to even say, is that we can maybe look forward to Polyev as to, stop spending money foolishly. And he's already
Mhm.
committed to, we're not sending money to, overseas for stupidity, lunacy. And when you see the amount of money that, I'd broken down, what we have for financial aid, and there's $500,000 of Canadian taxpayer money that's gone to fund abortions in 51 other countries. Now we have, and I'm not even going to get into the abortion side of things here, because I mean I'm past that stage of my life. It's no longer my fight.
Mhm.
And that can go through the the scientific, the
Philosophical, yeah.
philosophical, and the theological. That somebody else can have those arguments now. What I'm opposed to is that we have Canadians that have a Facebook group. And there's 8,000 of them that share recipes and how to prep food that they collect from dumpsters.
Hmm.
While, what was it? Yeah, $500 million is going to fund abortions in other countries. To me, that seems obscene. I mean, when we've got 2 million people hitting the food banks per month, just looking forward to hopefully stemming the flow of the mass immigration, hopefully stemming the flow of some of these garbage projects that we're funding,
Hmm.
coming into real some sort of realism with climate. Yeah, it's always going to change. Yeah, we're not a big part of that. Yeah, do we want to clean up our environment? Sure. I mean, those are the things that we're looking forward to. But I mean, a classic conservative is basically somebody that just wants to be left alone. And
Hmm.
and that's what we want from our government. Creating this bloated bureaucracy, of basically people that are going to vote for you is another thing. The entire carbon grift has created a few hundred jobs that pays out a few $100 million. Will they still try to claim that we get back more than they take?
Hmm.
No, what you've done is you've created more voters for yourself, and you're grifting off of people that aren't smart enough to realize that, or people that don't think that they pay these fees out. I mean, the $10 daycare, it's the same. He's not going to have an easy job when he comes in, and there are going to be some harsh realities that some of these people are going to have to face, and he's going to have to tackle this properly. Will some people be intimidated by that? Will some people be opposed to it? Absolutely. Is he going to come off looking really terrible on a lot of these situations? And that's going to be another thing. They will screech into the abyss as long as they can.
Yeah.
Kill CBC, make life cheaper, more affordable, and stay out of our lives. I mean, if he can accomplish those things, we'd pretty much figured out everything else prior to Trudeau. We don't need more of that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, don't get me wrong. I am hopeful that and it does seem like he is going to be our next prime minister, that it will be orders of magnitude better than what we've been used to for the last 8-ish years. Um, that being said, I've watched his rise before he got to the leader of the Conservative Party and after he got to the leader of the Conservative Party. And if I had to define his characteristics or his personality, at least as it opposes his political position, it is that of like an Instagram influencer mixed with a used car salesman. Like he understands the position to move people for his benefit. And sure, that's you could say that of any high level politician. That is the game that they have to play to get to the high level. But I watched as he made one photo op during the the trucker convoy just to say that he was there, but didn't really support it. I watched during the million person march where he had an internal memo to all of the Conservative Party leaders saying, don't say anything publicly about this. And then after the fact, when he realized that his base was polling like it was for it, said that we are for this and the Liberals were against it. Like, I understand that he's got his finger in the wind for popularity. And I just have to presume that if that's who he is politically, that's who he'll be when he has the power to do things as well. He'll play the moderate card as much as he can. You're not really going to get a conservative. You're going to get somebody who can do the safest things as far as he can push into his base. And I don't know if the conservative base in Canada is really that conservative anymore. I think that's basically moderate. And so what you're going to get is better than Trudeau, but I don't think that you're going to undo everything past like the price of milk.
To a certain extent, I can agree with you. And on the same side of things, the entire pandemic was run through like the restrictions and policies. It was all run through support based on media running surveys. So if they polled for more masking was implemented. And it was only when people started rejecting this that they had to start rejecting it as well. So there is a certain amount of popularity that you must maintain for leadership. But at the same time, there are certain things that can be implemented to better lifestyles without having to give away the farm, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yep, yep. That's what I mean by moderates. Like, I think common sense is, which is the thing he always platforms himself on, is actually the easy middle to hit. But I don't know if we're going to see a change to C11. I don't know if we're going to see a change to C18. I don't know if we're going to see a rolling back of C63 if it gets implemented. Like, I don't know to what degree he's willing to undo the actual real totalitarian implements that this government has been setting themselves up for. I guess we'll see.
Well, and democracy, as you know, I think what Trudeau did is when he came in, is he basically exploited the democracy as we have for we see it for Canadian. There has to be something changed in our charters, in our constitutions. There has to be some implementation where we can never see a ruler go on like this, despite
Mm,
the unpopularity. 70% of the country is against a carbon tax increase, against it completely. Trudeau came out and said, I know I'm not popular because of this, but I'm doing it anyways.
mhm.
That's the exact opposite of democracy in my, in my perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I am totally on board with getting Trudeau out for all of the same reasons that you just mentioned, and hopefully he will this term. I have a nagging consideration that maybe he somehow swindles his way into a fourth term, and then everybody's going to hurt. And I think at that point it will swing significantly the other direction. Like, it may be that we need more hurt than we've had during the pandemic, which is hard to say, to be able to get the amount of unpopularity that is required to actually make lasting change.
Well, we got a carbon tax hitting April 1st this year, and there's going to be another carbon tax, an additional or in addition to the carbon tax hitting April 1st before the next election. So that's how much more do people need to hurt? We're going to find out. Drew,
Mhm.
we're coming on about an hour here, so I'm just going to take thank you for the time that you've given me. Thank you for the absolutely for what you do. And if you want to find Drew, you'll find him on the Social Disorder podcast. He's also got a Substack that goes along with it. Look for his books on Amazon. Sounds like some interesting reads there. And yeah, man, look forward to seeing you back in the province, and we'll catch another burger when you're around.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, Sheldon. Thanks for having me on. And if people want to pre-order that second book, it's coming out April 1st, but you can get your pre-order in now, which really helps us bump up in the Amazon algorithm. So any help out there, if the topic of truth is at all interesting to you, you're going to want to read this book. So get your pre-order copy bought today, and it will be shipped out April 1st.
All right, and I'll leave some links in the Substack that goes along with this. All right, thanks again, Drew.
All right. See you, Sheldon.